Okay, welcome and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. I am Alexis and I am a librarian here at the Hudson Library. I'm very excited to introduce you to tonight's author. His name is Christopher Gorham, and he is here to discuss his new book, The Confidant. The Confidant is a never before told biography of Anna Rosenberg, the woman whom Life magazine called far and away the most important woman in American government and perhaps the most important official female in the world. Copies of the book are available for purchase at Hudson's independent bookstore, The Learned Owl, and we will be putting a link in the chat to purchase the book on their website if you're interested. As usual, there will be time tonight for a Q&A with Christopher, so please feel free to leave your questions and submit them throughout the duration of the program using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And now to introduce our author tonight. Christopher Gorham is a lawyer and teacher of modern American history at Westford Academy, which is just outside of Boston. He holds degrees from the University of Michigan, Tufts, and Syracuse University College of Law. His writing has appeared in the Washington Post and other online publications, and The Confidant is his first book. So before Christopher's discussion this evening, we have a quick video to play that will help to give some more context for the book and Anna herself, and will help to kind of jumpstart our conversation tonight.
The New York Times called her one of the most influential women in the country's public affairs for a quarter of a century. Life magazine said she was far and away the most important woman in American government. Her name was Anna Rosenberg, and her story has never been told before.
I came over here from Budapest when I was 8 years old.
She made her own way in a man's world.
They were amazed, they were shocked, they were troubled, but I must say most of them were just a little bewildered.
She was invited into the circle of a couple named Franklin and Eleanor.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
And became an advisor and confidant to a president in peace and war.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
As the Cold War exploded into conflict, she was named to the highest position any woman had ever held in the American military.
Mrs. Rosenberg, wartime envoy of Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, will add...
Then, Joe McCarthy targeted her as a communist.
Where a communist is concerned, she is not a free agent.
That's a goddamn lie.
The Confidant. Coming March 2023.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. I am pleased to be with you, the Friends of the Hudson Library. I want to thank Alexis for hosting and for Nathan for helping out with the program tonight. I will start by maybe this alternative history. What if we were in history class and the teacher, the professor said, we all remember the Jewish American civilian woman who lived in New York, who was a top official in the Pentagon, who was a vital advisor to Franklin Roosevelt, one of the closest advisors to Franklin Roosevelt during World War II, who later became one of the key architects of the early Cold War up through as the United States was occupying West Germany, Japan, trying to hold communism to Eastern Europe, and then there was a war in Korea. We all remember her, don't we? Of course we don't, because Anna Rosenberg once had been famous but was lost to history. About 5 or 6 years ago, I'm a high school history teacher outside Boston, as Alexis said. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I saw a photograph of this striking looking woman with President Harry Truman. They were both big smiles on their faces. And the caption below said, Assistant Secretary of Defense, Anna Rosenberg. And I thought, well, we've all heard of Frances Perkins. We've heard of, obviously, Eleanor Roosevelt. But this is such a high position, and to never hear of this woman, to never have heard of her before as a top person in the military establishment, I was intrigued, and I put her name on a list of research topics for my students, my juniors. And a couple of the students picked her to write their research paper on. And they came to me after a couple of days. They said, Mr. Gorham, there's no books. We can't find anything on her. And they were right. There were no books on Anna Rosenberg, and she was tough to sort of track down. Fortunately, we found that her papers were at Harvard University's Schlesinger Library, which is only about 2 miles from me and not far from the school. So in the spring of 2019, my wife and I met these students down at the library, and I'll never forget that day. The librarians, the research librarians, rolled out the carts with her boxes of documents and the silk white gloves we put on. And one of my students said, Mr. Gorham, come over here. And we opened up the crate, and there were handwritten letters from Harry Truman, Franklin Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, General Eisenhower, and many, many others, all to Anna Rosenberg, all extolling her virtues and her successes. And I thought right then and there, I would write this book. And maybe what we'll do is, if Nathan can roll a couple of these first 4 images. Here, let's stop on this one for a second. The first one you saw was Anna in Budapest. I'll give you a tiny bit of her early background. She and her family were she was the daughter of a prominent family in Budapest in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Her father actually furnished the emperor's palace. He got involved into a contract dispute with the emperor and was ruined financially. And Anna's father had to come to the United States. He emigrated to New York. And his circumstances were very different. It took him 2 years to sort of rebuild his life. And after 2 years, he could summon the rest of his family to join him. So Anna and her sister and mother, sailed under the Statue of Liberty to New York. And it was the years right before the American entry into World War I. And Nathan, if you could maybe skip ahead one. At this time, 1916, 1917, Anna, who is there sitting in the foreground of that photo, was fired up with suffrage. She was, like her father, the United States was so different than the empire where she came from. There was voting, there was jury duty, you could have a voice. And this was just transformative to her. As women sought the right to vote, Anna started joining marches, even as a teenager. She was in the New York Times, if you can believe it, for being a student leader as a teenager, 16, 17 years old. She was selling Liberty bonds on the streets of New York, and she was volunteering, as you see here, as a nurse, along with her sister. So she was, from the very beginning, a lifelong patriot. Nathan, maybe we skip ahead one. That's Anna over on the far right. She's talking to a group of women, and she's talking about voting, because not only was Anna Rosenberg interested in suffrage and helping however she could the war effort, but she saw that if you did those things, you could move the needle. You could make the country that was her adopted country a better one. And so she got involved in politics, even as she was beginning her career in labor relations. Hers was kind of a parallel track where she was doing both. Very energetic she was. And here she is running she's one of the first women to run campaigns, not only at the state level, but she ran a U.S. Congress campaign as well. One of the first women campaign managers in American history. And here she is saying to the other women, get involved. We can make a difference. Nathan, if you want to skip ahead one. Like I said, Anna was a labor relations pioneer, really. Mediation was what she did best. She had that kind of personality where she could bring tough union guys together with wealthy business owners. These business owners would say an hour of her time would have saved me $10,000. The union guys said, if Anna tells us something, we know she's on the level. So she had the trust, really remarkable, of both sides. So she was a gifted mediator. And in 1928, she attended a tea put on by Eleanor Roosevelt, 1928 in New York, at a hotel in the city. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, young lady, what do you do for a living? And Anna said, well, I am in labor relations and public relations. Eleanor said, well, my husband is running for governor of New York, and he could use someone like that on his team. So Anna Rosenberg, still in her 20s, became part of the team of Franklin Roosevelt's gubernatorial campaign, along with people like Louis Howe and Francis Perkins. And that was the beginning of what would be a relationship with Roosevelt that lasted all the way until his death in 1945. In this picture here, you obviously, most people would recognize Eleanor Roosevelt to the right, Anna Rosenberg there in the middle. The man on the other side of her is Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. The little flower and the first lady during World War II did not always get along, and they caused Franklin Roosevelt a lot of consternation. So Franklin Roosevelt put Anna in charge of keeping those two folks apart and making them play nice. So here's a great photo that kind of speaks to that. Let's skip ahead one. After Anna Rosenberg helped Franklin Roosevelt win the governorship of New York, the Great Depression settled in, and he unveiled the New Deal. He tried out a lot of these plans in New York, and now it was time to scale it up nationwide. Anna Rosenberg came to Washington, or rather she stayed in New York, but was working with Washington throughout the New Deal as the only woman regional director of massive New Deal programs like Social Security. When Anna was signing up 6 million New Yorkers for Social Security, which did not exist until this time, just a transformative, dynamic bit of how democracy can work at its best. Women with gray hair would say to Anna, please don't tell my husband my real age. Men with gray hair would say to Anna, please don't tell my employer my true age, because I want to keep this job. And Anna said, Uncle Sam and I will keep your secrets. But it was really in 1941, at the very outset of World War II, where Anna became very instrumental to Roosevelt and to the country. In the months before Pearl Harbor, the defense industries were already cranking up, building the ordnance, the bombs, the airplanes, and the ships for a war they knew was coming, and also to provide materials for our allies that were fighting the Nazi onslaught. But they were not hiring Black Americans. And A. Philip Randolph, the Black leader of the day, was going to march on Washington for equality. And while we have fond memories and we're proud of the march that happened in 1964, a march in 1941 worried President Roosevelt because Washington was a Southern town with a Southern mentality, and he was fearful of violence. And the disunity and maybe even violence to be shown to the world at a time where we needed unity was very dismaying to the president. So he asked Anna Rosenberg, the gifted mediator, his Mrs. Fix-It, to talk to A. Philip Randolph and to see if she could do something that both sides could be proud of. And as I argue in the book, I think she was the chief drafter of what became Executive Order 8802, which mandated the hiring of Black Americans in defense industries and set forth a watchdog provision that mandated that would be the case. One historian calls it the largest effort by the federal government towards civil rights since Reconstruction. The story of how Roosevelt signed it is a great one. Anna had the draft in her purse, but she was too fearful to go before the president and ask him to sign it because she knew that it was something that he kind of had to be cajoled into. Eleanor said, as you can see in this picture, Anna was very fond of hats. Eleanor Roosevelt said, Anna, go down to the boutiques of Georgetown and get yourself one of your fanciest hats. Get yourself an expensive hat that you like. Give yourself the confidence to come back to the White House and talk to my husband. So Anna did. She went down to a shop and got a fancy new hat. She knew that Roosevelt loved her hats. She comes back to the White House, walks into the Oval Office without even her customary greeting, how's your day, Mr. President? And she takes the executive order out of her purse. She spreads it on his desk and she says, "Sign it, Mr. President, sign it." And he did. That became Executive Order 8802. Let's skip on a photo. And let's maybe skip on one more. In 1942 and 1943, we all think the arsenal of democracy was sort of this monolithic, wonderful thing that you just turned a switch and all of a sudden America's factories were building the tanks and the planes to withstand Nazism. But it wasn't quite that easy. There was a real problem with the labor supply. People were leaving jobs, men were leaving jobs at the steel mill and the shipyard and going to work in the airplane factories where the conditions were a lot easier. And this was really bad for the shipyards and the heavy factories, the steel yards. There was also labor piracy. There was absenteeism. In some cases, there just wasn't enough workers at all to fulfill these contracts. And, lives were on the stake in Europe and in the Pacific. So 1942-43, Franklin Roosevelt dispatched Anna Rosenberg to Buffalo, Niagara, in Buffalo, New York, and that whole region was one of the biggest, most vital areas for defense. They built everything there: bombs, belt buckles, helmets, parachutes, ordnance for the Allies, airplanes for the Russians, everything. And the contracts were being imperiled. So Anna Rosenberg got to Buffalo, and the first thing she did is, we need more women. Not only single women, we need married women, married with children. And she had to set up the infrastructure to do that. We had to have childcare. We had to have playgrounds for the kids. We had to have movie theaters open at 5 in the morning so that these women after their shift could go to a movie and relax, or places where they could cash their check at 2 in the morning after their shift. And it worked. She got thousands of women to come on board. She got Black Americans to come on board. And she told the leaders of Buffalo, this is no time for discrimination. It's all hands on deck. High schoolers pitched in. Disabled Americans pitched in. Essentially, it was the population of Little Rock, Arkansas that she hired and got into the Buffalo, Niagara region. And the contracts were fulfilled, and the arsenal of democracy was able to fire on all cylinders. Time magazine called it the Rosenberg Plan. It later became known as the Buffalo Plan. And it was so excellent, and it worked so brilliantly that it was rolled out nationwide, from the shipyards of the East Coast to the airplane factories of the West Coast. And for the duration of the war, the Buffalo Plan was the model of how labor was divided among the factories and the shipyards that needed it. Go on to another slide. And maybe there's Anna in an airplane. Maybe go on one more. In 1944, let me step back a second. Way back in 1917, a young Franklin Roosevelt was sent to Europe by President Wilson to look at the trenches of World War I. It was an experience that changed Roosevelt forever. As president in 1944, he may have wanted to go follow the troops as they landed in D-Day and started racing across France, but he couldn't do it. So he sent Anna Rosenberg as his personal representative to the European theater of operations to see what the GIs were going through, the soldiers were going through as they fought the Germans across France towards the Third Reich itself. Anna slept in tents. She ate rations off the hood of Jeeps. These guys took photos out of their helmet and showed her the pictures of their kids and their sweethearts at home. And they shared their dreams and hopes with her should they be fortunate enough to come back to the US. She was surprised to learn that these guys, they didn't want to learn more vocational stuff. They didn't, they weren't really interested in that. What they really wanted was an education. This whole generation had grown up in the Great Depression, in war, and they wanted a college education. They wanted a grad school. They wanted to better themselves. They wanted a piece of the country that they were helping to save. And she loved that. She loved learning that. And she filled up a dozen notebooks with their remarks and their comments. And when she got back to President Roosevelt in Washington, he lit up, she said. He lit up. That's what they need. They want an education. And that changed the direction of the GI Bill and gave it its educational thrust, which, historians will say really transformed the post-war and led to the emergence of a giant middle class. Let's skip ahead. Like I said, Anna was seeing what the men saw. She saw death. There's a picture of her, not in this slide, but there's a picture of her over a German corpse. I mean, she saw widows and orphans, all the things that you would see in war, we can imagine. She knew these guys would return different people than the ones that left. Here she is in the forward zone wearing a helmet with General Walker. We'll skip ahead. Here's an even more famous general. This, of course, is General George S. Patton. She was mostly embedded with Patton's army as it raced across France. She called George Patton Georgie. She called Walter Bedell Smith, General Walter Bedell Smith, Beetle. She was extremely fond of Omar Bradley, the GI's general. And she was very fond of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, too. So she really admired these guys. They admired her. One incident that wasn't very admirable, though, was George Patton's dog. When she arrived at his headquarters, George Patton had a big, nasty dog, and it bit Anna. And that was a close call for her during World War II. But she was actually pinned. She and her aide were actually pinned down by German sniper fire around the town of Metz late in 1944. We'll skip ahead. Anna was sent. In fact, Anna had the last lunch that President Roosevelt ever ate in the White House, one-on-one with him in the sunroom. And at that lunch, President Roosevelt said, I want you to go back to Europe. I want you to follow up what you did in 44 and take care of the GIs that are over there, see if they need anything. And by the time she was there, President Roosevelt had died, and President Truman was the commander-in-chief. The other thing was the Allies, the Americans and the Russians had uncovered and liberated the very first concentration camps. When Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley saw this, Eisenhower cabled Washington immediately. He said, I want you to send journalists. I want you to send Congress people. I want people here to bear witness to these atrocities. Anna was already in Europe, so her mission was changed by Truman. He said, I want you to go and bear witness to the concentration camps at the behest of General Eisenhower, which she did. She went to the Nordhausen camp just days after its liberation and saw men and women who had suffered tremendously unspeakable conditions. And I describe that very profound experience that she only spoke about once, but I talk about that in the book. After she returned from the war zone, a few months later in October of 1945, just a couple of months after the end of World War II, Anna Rosenberg, the Jewish Hungarian immigrant who came to the United States as a little girl, was awarded with the first Medal of Freedom awarded to any man or woman in United States history. Here she is receiving that award. We'll skip ahead. Here she is having a nice moment with President Truman. We'll skip ahead. Here's Anna at her desk in New York. As I said, her career was often parallel. In Washington, working sort of as a behind-the-scenes policymaker and shaper with Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, later with Eisenhower and Johnson. And in New York, working in Madison Avenue, working in public relations and labor relations. Over her shoulder is her cherished signed picture of Franklin Roosevelt. We'll skip ahead.
Christopher, if you don't mind me asking, did she have anyone working with her? So when she went to Washington, did she have anybody working with her in New York to kind of help with the work there, or was she pretty much kind of a one-woman show?
That's a great question. Her son, who was a lieutenant in the Army in World War II, so they were sort of both. Her son was her partner, really, in her public relations firm. But during World War II, he was in the service. So he went over to Europe and served just like she did. So their business sort of went fallow. And in fact, when she returned to New York in 46 and 47, she found it very hard to make ends meet, and she required loans from friends to get back on her feet. So it was a real sacrifice, not only, to put her, literally her life on the line, but to put her business sort of on ice and have to rebuild it after the war. When she did rebuild it, though, she had a staff of about a dozen, and they just they loved her. I interviewed one of the staff members that worked with her at her Anna Rosenberg Associates. They just thought the world of her. They didn't know what she'd done in the past with all the presidents because she didn't trumpet her own career like that, but they just thought she was a wonderful woman to work with. Great question. And we can skip ahead from this quote. After she returned to New York and rebuilt her business, it was 1950, and she was in a great spot. She'd finally had the money to purchase her apartment rather than rent. Her son and Anna were working and bringing in new clients at Anna Rosenberg and Associates. And one day in October 1950, she was opening up her mail and she got a handwritten letter from that man to her right, George C. Marshall. George Marshall, of course, was the architect of victory in World War II, the chief of staff. But he'd gone into retirement afterwards, but was pulled out by President Truman when the Korean War was going disastrously in the early months of that war. One of the first things Marshall did when he was in the Pentagon is write Anna Rosenberg, a civilian woman in New York, and say, Anna, I want you to come down to the Pentagon and be my number two to help rebuild this American army, which has been decimated by budget cuts. We have to occupy West Germany, Japan. We have to keep the Soviets out of Eastern Europe. And we now have this war going badly. And being the patriot that she was, she said, when George Marshall asked me to come down to Washington, I knew I had to go. And she did. Let's skip ahead one. In fact, let's go back one. I'm sorry, Nathan. At that time I think you saw the 2-minute clip at the very beginning of our program tonight. Joe McCarthy got involved. She had been nominated to serve as Assistant Secretary of Defense. A right-wing radio star named Fulton Lewis and Joe McCarthy teamed up, and they tried to smear her. They tried to label her as a communist. And over 2 very dramatic weeks in December 1950, this was played out in Washington. It riveted the country. Edward R. Murrow was involved. Newspaper columnists were involved all across the country, some Republican, some Democrat. It is perhaps the most dramatic chapter of the book. And McCarthy had ended careers. Many women's careers had been ended by McCarthy in the early days of McCarthyism. But when he tangled with Anna Rosenberg, he got something he might not have bargained for. But I'll let readers take a look at that chapter when they see the book. Let's take a look at the next slide. Like I said, when Anna Rosenberg got to the Pentagon, it was to rebuild the Army, and the Army in Korea was rebuilt. And here she is. She made 2 trips to Korea in the fall of 51, again in the fall of 1952. And really the same type of thing. You know, she looked in the footlockers, she looked in the tent, she saw how the men were living, what they were eating. And she would take groups of men away from the generals, away from the colonels, so she could talk to them frankly. You know, tell me what's going on, boys. Give me the real lowdown. And they did. And they were very, very fond of her. One of the units commemorated her with by naming her Miss Wolfhound of 1952. She beat out Doris Day and Marilyn Monroe. Another group wrote on a shell, artillery shell, to the communists, compliments of Anna Rosenberg. We'll skip ahead. One of the things that Anna was most proud of as Assistant Secretary of Defense was integrating the schools that were on the bases. There were Army bases down in the southern states. A lot of them were still segregated by race. So you could be a black serviceman in the Army or the Marines, but your child cannot go to a white school on the very Army base that sent you there. And this was in contravention, of course, to Harry Truman's executive order that said otherwise. So when Anna Rosenberg went to the Pentagon, one of the first things she did was put an end to this. And she had to twist the arms of the Department of Education. She had to twist the arms of some military men, some civilians, but she got the bases down, she got the schools rather desegregated and integrated in by the end of 1953, which was actually before schools were integrated in the country at large with the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Very, very a lifelong commitment to civil rights which I talk about it in the book. We'll skip ahead. Here she is with the generals in Korea on one of those trips. We'll move ahead. We'll move ahead one more time. When Anna got back from her trips to Europe in 1944 and again in 1945, she spent days writing letters to the mothers and the fathers of the servicemen that she'd met overseas. She talked about how much weight they put on, you know, how much tanned they were, you know, whether the mustaches looked good on them and so forth. She did the exact same thing in Korea. She spent, I think it was 4 days in her apartment writing 400 letters to parents around the country, telling them about their youngsters in serving in Korea. And she got, in return, she got Valentine's cards from these guys. She got all kinds of gifts and commemorations. And one mother wrote back, and she was so pleased with Anna's letter that she offered to send Anna a ham. And Anna wrote back and said, well, I appreciate the offer. Please don't send me a ham. So it was, they're great letters to read. And in those boxes at Harvard, that was one of my, it was just super enjoyable to go through that. We'll skip ahead. 1937, a beanpole thin young guy from Texas came down to Washington. He'd won a congressional special election. His name was Lyndon Johnson. And he immediately, he was an immediate friend of Anna Rosenberg. He was a believer in the New Deal, believer in Roosevelt, and Anna really took him sort of under her wing. She helped out with his fundraising, which was important to him at the time. And they had a lifelong relationship that went from 1937 all the way up through when he died in 1974. Here they are face to face. She was at the Pentagon and she wanted all the money in the world for the GIs and the soldiers and their families. And Senator Johnson on the Armed Services Committee, you know, obviously had budgetary considerations to think about. So here they are, maybe not having an agreement, maybe more of a disagreement, but you can see Anna was not afraid to go head to head with the powerful in Washington. Alexis, how are we doing on time here?
We are doing great. We're at 7:30 right now. Yeah.
Well, if I have time to talk about a few more slides, then we can get on to our Q&A.
You do. Yes, that sounds great.
Let's move ahead. Let's go back one. Let's stay on Johnson just for a second. Lyndon Johnson was on the Senate Armed Services Committee for those 2 weeks in December when Anna was dragged through the mud. And that bonded their friendship. Like I said, they'd been friends since the 30s, but that was a real bond. And Anna was such an incredible person. She wasn't only a friend and advisor to these powerful men, but Lady Bird Johnson was tremendously fond of Anna Rosenberg, Mimi Eisenhower, Eleanor Roosevelt. After Franklin died in 1945, those two women, Eleanor and Anna, who had always respected one another, but it became a loving relationship. They were extremely fond of each other. Anna never forgot to send Eleanor Roosevelt a birthday gift of flowers, of candy, a hat that she'd picked up. And Eleanor responded by inviting her over for dinner in New York. And those are wonderful letters to read, the correspondence between Anna and Eleanor Roosevelt. But in 1950, Senator Lyndon Johnson really bonded his relationship with Anna by being a defender of her honor. She had served her country for decades. And the thought that she would be smeared wrongfully and baselessly was just something that he couldn't tolerate. So they were great friends. In fact, he said, Anna, you've been a true friend across all these many, many years, in a very heartfelt letter that he sent to her after the Selma march. Let's move on. I've talked about a lot of presidents: Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Eisenhower, very fond of Anna. You can, which is interesting. He was obviously a Republican president. At the time, Anna was marrying her second husband, also a Republican. They saw Eisenhower as a moderate, somebody who could continue the path of what the United States was doing to protect itself abroad and grow the middle class at home. The one president that saw Anna more or less as a fundraiser was John F. Kennedy. Eleanor Roosevelt said, here's a great opportunity to get Anna Rosenberg in the cabinet, maybe Secretary of Labor. He had other advisors telling him the same thing, get Anna in the cabinet, but he was just not interested in that. It was a stag party. The Kennedy men were not interested in women at the highest levels of decision-making. And it was a disappointment to Anna and to Eleanor Roosevelt and other women around the country. But being the loyal Democrat that she was, she agreed to be a fundraiser, and a very powerful one, for John F. Kennedy. We'll skip ahead. In fact, Anna Rosenberg, if you can believe it, was the co-host of the birthday party in 1962 for President Kennedy, where Marilyn Monroe sang the breathy version of Happy Birthday. Here you can see the back of President Kennedy's head, but next to him throughout the entire evening that night at Madison Square Garden was Anna Rosenberg. And there they are looking at the big birthday cake. Skip ahead. Go back one. We'll stay on that just for a sec. Anna Rosenberg and her co-host Arthur Krim settled on the performers for that event. There was Danny Kaye. I believe there was Ella Fitzgerald. There was a ballet troupe. And of course, there was Marilyn Monroe, who was to appear at the very, very end of the program and sing to the president. After the party, after Marilyn Monroe came out and sang, she was quite late in doing so. As some of you may know, there was an after party. They went back to the Krim's apartment in New York. If we can go ahead one. And it was at that party at the Krim's apartment that the only photograph ever of John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Marilyn Monroe was taken. This is Marilyn Monroe with, I think, one of the Kennedy brothers-in-law. Very sadly, she would only live about 70 or 71 more days, Marilyn Monroe. When Anna was in Korea visiting the troops, she came back and told a reporter the troops always asked her to send Marilyn Monroe to entertain them. And Marilyn Monroe in Los Angeles read that in the newspaper. And she said to a newspaper reporter out in LA, she said, Mrs. Anna Rosenberg wants me to go to Korea, so I'll think about doing it. And in 1954, she did. Marilyn Monroe went to Korea and entertained the troops as that war was winding down. Go ahead and skip. In 1959, this is sort of at the very, very end of the period where Anna Rosenberg was a household name. She appeared on Edward R. Murrow's television show, Person to Person. And after he introduced her and went through all the many things that she'd done in her long career as a public servant, from the New Deal to World War II and Korea, Edward R. Murrow said, Anna, you have quite a book to write someday. And she said, Ed, that's a book that will never be written. But here we have it.
Do you think she would have been, if she was alive today, do you think she would have been okay with the book, or do you think she would have rather written it herself?
Well, she would not have rather written it herself. In fact, that comment goes on. She said, that's a book that will never be written someday. But then she went on to soften that a little bit. She said, I leave the writing to writers. Mm-hmm. So she did not consider herself. She's very self-conscious about her handwriting, her spelling. She spoke with an accent, which maybe you heard from the trailer. But she was not interested in writing her memoir. She found that very distasteful for reasons that maybe we'll talk about in the Q&A. I'll delve into that a little bit more, but that's a great question. And we might be at the end here, but let's skip ahead. There's Anna as a grandmother, and that's her grandson, Tommy. I interviewed him for the book. He told me lovely, lovely stories, really wonderful stories about her. And what was great is, he's 65-year-old guy. He didn't know at the time when he was in his 20s and teens, he didn't know about his grandmother's exploits as a hero during the war and afterwards. All he knew her was as a grandmother, and it was really wonderful, the stories that he shared. He was at the book launch here in Cambridge just a few days ago and got emotional starting to talk about his grandmother. But it was a pretty magical night for me and a very magical night for him too. So that's Anna and her grandson. I think we have one more. And there she is. And you might think, well, that looks like behind her, that looks like 2 degrees from, college or university. They are not. Anna despite being in the New York Times, even as a teenager, did not graduate from high school for reasons that you can read about in the book. So what are those things behind her? They're commemorations. I think one is from a brewers union, a union of beer brewers, and it says, "Anna, you are tops," which just shows not only union guys, but titans of industry both respected her and valued her opinion on a variety of things. Well, I think I've talked enough, and maybe we should open it up to some Q&A.
That sounds good. It looks like someone had said they want to thank you for writing the book, and her story is one that should be told, especially for young women fighting for equality. Do you think Anna considered herself a feminist? I remember from the book that she declined to work with Eleanor Roosevelt and the New York State Democratic Party kind of early on in her career for some of the suffrage work that they were doing, but she certainly was an advocate for women's involvement in government and in the military as well.
Yeah. She saw what her sort of philosophy was for herself and for other women was, if we have to sacrifice just like the men are. And this is during the Great Depression. This is during World War II. If women sacrifice just like the men are, if they go into the factory and work that shift that ends at 5 a.m. or 2 a.m, then, and white women and black women alike, that social equality will come from that respect will come from that. And that was her philosophy. So that was what she would counsel women. She would say, take on these responsibilities. I know it's not fun to be a mother with children and be working this late shift at the aircraft factory, but during wartime, let's do it, and you will be respected for it. And she was also a proponent of women going into the military and serving alongside the men. So yes, that was her philosophy for sure.
Someone was wondering if you could talk about her husbands and what they did.
Her first husband was a veteran of World War I, and they met when they were very, very young, 1918 or so, married in 1919 or 1920. Mike Rosenberg was an executive became executive at a well-known carpet company in New York City, where he spent his entire career. And Anna, of course, was traveling from Washington to New York back and forth throughout many, many decades of her career. They separated in 1956 after 1920, 1950, 35 years or so of marriage. They separated, and Anna remarried a man named Paul Hoffman, who had been the first administrator of the Marshall Plan. And she and Paul Hoffman were married from 1962 until he died in, I think, 1974. And he was, I guess, more like her in his involvement in politics, his involvement in the Washington and New York corridor. And they counted among their friends Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson. Sure.
I know you mentioned as we were going through the pictures that she became kind of a unofficial advisor to Roosevelt. Do you know why he never gave her an official title or an official position?
She had titles that were in these agencies, like the office, they used to call it manpower. Now they'd call it, I guess, personnel, but it was the Office of War Manpower. So she did have a title. And in the New Deal, she had titles like Regional Director of Social Security. But why he relied on her almost like a Secretary of Labor, even though she wasn't Secretary of Labor, was a very Rooseveltian pattern where he would have two people or two groups working on the same problem at the same time in parallel. And it was a way to get people, in a way, to compete against each other, but also to see who could solve the problem the most efficiently. And that, of course, led to friction with Frances Perkins, who was the Secretary of Labor throughout the whole Roosevelt presidency. And Frances Perkins and Anna was very respectful to Frances Perkins, but sometimes Frances Perkins was not very respectful to Anna, which is described in the book. Fantastic question, though. She fit a Rooseveltian pattern of this sort of having two people solve problems at the same time to see who could get there first. And Anna got there first.
Someone wanted to know, was there a successor to Anna Rosenberg, someone who was as influential as her in a government position?
That's just a fantastic question. In a column that came out after Anna Rosenberg died in 1983, a New York Times columnist, the column was called Hers. It was dealt with women's issues. The writer of that piece said, our generation always looked up to three women. We looked up to Eleanor Roosevelt, we looked up to Frances Perkins, and we looked up to Anna Rosenberg. They were our models of engagement, of what you could get done in Washington and elsewhere if you just put your mind to it. And it seemed like in the late 80s or 90s or even 2000s, there would have been a successor to Anna Rosenberg. Another scholar wrote, she was a pioneer with no followers in a way. So I'm not sure, on the one hand, I guess I believe more the New York Times columnist that women did follow in her footsteps in the Congress, in the Senate, in governorships. And maybe it took a couple of extra decades, but we can see that today with Gretchen Whitmer and states like Michigan and New York and others that have women governors and, more women in Congress than ever before. So it maybe have taken a couple of extra decades, but I think we're getting there.
We have a question about whether or not she supported the sort of the second wave feminism movement in the late 60s, early 70s.
Another wonderful question. I don't think that her philosophy matched up very well with that wave of feminism. And in one, I guess the evidence of that would be, Anna Rosenberg felt that the sort of womanliness or demureness or, that was part of her arsenal. And she told Edward R. Murrow this, she said, he sort of made fun of her hats. And don't they take away some of the seriousness? If you're wearing a frilly hat at a big, fancy, important meeting in Washington or New York, doesn't that detract from your mission? And she said, absolutely not. That I shouldn't, she said, dress, we wouldn't say this today, but she said, why should I dress like a man? We wouldn't ask men to do that. So I don't think that her philosophy necessarily matched up with that group. That said, there were women at the time in the 60s and 70s that were saying to people like John F. Kennedy, here's a person you really should have on the cabinet. And frustratingly, he didn't put her on.
Kind of speaking towards that, she was definitely like a powerful female person in these high-ranking positions. And I wonder, if you could speak to how she gained the trust of men in positions of power, especially because she was a woman in a time where that wasn't something very normal to see.
It was very abnormal. She had, in her grandson, Tom, and I talked about this a lot, she had an EQ that was superhuman. She had the emotional quotient that was off the charts. And, when I talked about how both union guys and, these titans of it, literally the Rockefeller brothers were part of her, she was the mentor of Nelson Rockefeller. So you have guys that are brewing beer and Nelson Rockefeller, and they both think the world of her. And not only that, but so she could talk tough, she could use salty language when needed, but she could also be very demure and very flattering to men, which some men obviously liked. She could do that, at the snap of the finger. But she didn't lose women friends, which is very interesting. Women respected her. So, she didn't come across as, playing the man's game in a way that would cost her the friendship of women. As I say in the book, she was one of the boys and one of the girls. Just this amazing chameleon-like personality, always genuine though, regardless of who she was talking to.
Someone was curious to know if she ever returned to Budapest before her death and if she ever commented on the 56 revolution.
There's a tantalizing little sentence that goes way back that suggests that she might have gone to Budapest way back in like almost like when she would be an early college student, something in the early 20s. I didn't think that the source was, I couldn't corroborate it. So I maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. She traveled extensively to Europe, both, I know in 1937, 38 at the behest of Roosevelt, but also during the war and after the war. And her mother and sister traveled often to Budapest and spent time in their old home country, as well as places like Italy. Did she ever speak to the 56 uprisings? I don't recall coming across a specific statement, but I can tell you that she was extremely dismayed that not only had Hungary sort of been taken over by Nazi ideology, or some Hungarians had been taken over by Nazi ideology, but then had been subsequently taken over by communist ideology. So she felt she lost her home country, her birth country. So she was staunchly anti-communist, and I can only think that she would have been outraged by what the Russians did in Hungary in 1956.
Someone else was wondering, is there any relation between Anna and the Rosenbergs who were arrested for giving away World War II secrets? And if this couple of Rosenbergs kind of overshadowed the important work that she was doing at the time?
I want to go back to the Budapest question for 1 second, and then I'll talk about the atomic spies. The Rosenbergs, Tom and his wife that were at the launch event just a couple of days ago, said some of their relatives had gone back to Budapest and seen Anna's childhood home. And if you can believe it, it's the Russian embassy. Yeah, they said, there's guys with machine guns standing out front. And I thought to myself, well, she would have just been, she would have been brokenhearted to know that she was a defender of democracy for her life. Beg your pardon. Anna Rosenberg, part of how she disappeared from history was she shared the surname with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were accused and convicted of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. Rosenbergs around the country, and there's no relation. Anna Rosenberg had no relation to those Rosenbergs. And Rosenbergs around the country were shunned. They lost friends, they lost jobs. And that was part of the reason that Anna Rosenberg didn't trumpet her own career. It was just an unfortunate coincidence, but the timing was awful for her. This was right at the apex of her career when those Rosenbergs were convicted and then executed for espionage. Moreover, she did not have the college education or the Ivy League education that would have kept her flame alive in history, like Frances Perkins with Penn and Columbia. And like I said, she also felt that she had been having these conversations with presidents in confidence, and it wasn't her place to write the memoir or to write the autobiography. And that she's the confidant after all.
Definitely. Someone was curious to know, what grounds did McCarthy use to say that she was a communist?
So McCarthy and this right-wing radio star who is hugely popular, like Fulton Lewis had like 10 or 15 million listeners on over 500 stations. They found a guy in New York by the name of Ralph DeSola who would testify that he had seen Anna Rosenberg at a communist meeting way back in the 1930s. So Anna Rosenberg, Anna Marie Rosenberg, realized it wasn't her. So she went and found out in the New York phone book, there's 47 Anna Rosenbergs, because it's a name like Joe Smith in New York. So part of her defense was, how do you know it might have been Anna Rosenberg? It wasn't me, Anna Marie Rosenberg. And that was part of her defense.
Someone else was curious to know, did she ever consider running for elected office?
People like Roosevelt, Truman wanted her to. They suggested that she do. They had floated the ambassadorship to the Soviet Union. They had said mayor of New York many times. She appeared on the polls, who should be the next mayor of New York? And Anna Rosenberg would appear at the top of those polls. And she just wasn't interested. She was getting stuff done behind the scenes. And she also liked her life in New York, to the extent she could continue her career in her private life in New York and her travel to Italy. She liked doing that. So just had no interest in that. In fact, there was a rumor during the Roosevelt administration that he was going to relieve Francis Perkins and install Anna Rosenberg. I think, and I think I make the argument in the book that she probably told him that she wasn't interested. And that's one of the reasons that change never got made. Great question.
Kind of in speaking towards that of her just preferring to be kind of in behind the scenes, early in her career, she was advised not to seek recognition for her work. And I found it interesting as I was reading that later you quote her as saying, you can get a lot done if you give other people credit for what they do. People want credit and they deserve to have it. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to this kind of almost change in attitude and sort of, do you think she was tired of not receiving credit for all of the work that she was doing, or maybe she had always felt this way?
I think she was pretty consistent. It was never about her. She certainly liked, to an extent, she liked the attention from the journalists, and she liked the pose for the photographers from the magazines that were interviewing her. But she used those opportunities to talk to the media, to extend her beliefs or to give credit to the leaders that she so admired. It was really she never would direct attention back to her. And the idea of, delegating, she loved to delegate. She was comfortable delegating. And she gave those folks, those young people, oftentimes young people, all the credit in the world for being on her staff in Washington or New York. And, she trusted them to get the job done. They got the job done. That's part of when I was interviewing people that had worked with her. That's what they said. She would entrust us with a great deal of responsibility, but would give us the credit. So they all loved working for her.
Kind of to combine a few questions here. A couple people want to know when she was born, when she died, and if there was a cause to her death.
She was born on July 19th, 1899 in Budapest. And I was able to corroborate that. If you go to Wiki 6 months ago, that would have been incorrect. There was a 2-year gap. There was a 2-year differential in her real birth date, but I corroborated that a number of ways in the book. I think she might not have wanted to have been born in 1899 because, she did work for the Social Security Department, so she could have maybe fudged those numbers a little bit. She died in May of 1983 of cancer. After I don't think it was a very lengthy illness, but she died of cancer in 1983.
And then just as a final question to kind of round out our evening tonight, what do you hope readers will take away from your book once they finish reading?
I think just how inspiring this person is. And it doesn't have to just inspire women or Democrats or Republicans, or anybody can be inspired to this. If you're a citizen of the United States and you want housing equity, or if you want to expand democracy, or if you want to see the values that the greatest generation fought for, not only protected, but expanded, she's your person, because you don't have to have elected office. You don't have to be a household name. You can do a lot of this behind the scenes if you're only willing enough to work hard like Anna Rosenberg did, and be consistent and believe in the ideals of that greatest generation, that many of which we continue to this day.
Well, I want to thank you, Christopher, for coming and speaking with us tonight. It was a great presentation, and I've had many people come in the comments and say they really enjoyed it. Just a reminder to everyone, we have several programs coming up, virtual and in person here at the library, so feel free to check out our website and sign up for some of those upcoming programs. And thank you again, Christopher. This was wonderful.
Great to be with you all. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.